My name is JT Rooney. I don't know if you guys saw me on one of the other panels, but I work with a company called Silent Partners Studio. We are a content creation company based out of Montreal, and we have a second office in LA that I head up with a couple people. So, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about my past with Notch as well as our current companies. So it'll be kind of a blend of different things, and we'll go over a little bit of what live touring is like for big pop shows and big rock shows and stuff like that, and then talk a little bit also about how that worked with the kind of the growth of Notch, because it's kind of been along the same path. So let's talk a little bit about Silent Partners Studio. We are like I said, content and design studio. We do most of our work in big rock and pop shows. So on the left, there's a photo of Calvin Harris at Coachella, Super Bowl last year, and then Katy Perry's tour the year before. So really large venues, large capacity tours, large canvas, normally traditional content. We also do work in theater and opera as well in Montreal, as well as corporate, and just kind of all over the place. So here's a little bit, a quick sample of some of our work. I just wanted to give that a little bit of background so I can kind of see a little bit where we are. Lots of pop, like I said, you see like Katy Perry and Selena Gomez, that sort of stuff. But traditional graphic content, not a lot of that was done with Notch, but some of it actually was. So to continue on a little bit of background for myself, I used to work at a place called the New World Symphony down in Miami. It's this building in this beautiful Frank Gehry building called the New World Center, and it's a really cool space for. They're trying to kind of like make classical music really relevant again and really add technology and interactivity to performances. So it was a really great ground for me to kind of start and work with really great artists, and it was a really interesting start for me. After that, I continued on to work with a company called Lightborn, which is based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, in the U.S., and I did traditional content there with other pop stars and other events, and then I've done screen producing with some other companies such as Disney and a couple other familiar faces on here. To kind of talk about Notch, the first really big Notch show I did was actually Kanye West's St. Pablo tour a couple years back. It was in 2016, I think. Most people don't actually think about this show as a Notch show because a lot of it got cut because of Kanye. That just happens. But it's an interesting conversation for people at this conference to understand. We don't normally talk about it that much because it's not a big visual show. It's all about this awesome light rig that he flew on. It was an amazing show. But for the very beginnings of it, there was actually a screen you can see on the side of the stage. So in all rehearsals and stuff like that, there was a screen, and eventually it turned into just IMAX. So it's an interesting conversation about how, shows change and stuff like that. But it was us kind of figuring out what Notch is at the very beginning. So there's just some really rough stills, but it kind of shows a little bit of. There's a pixel grid at the very top. We were pixel mapping the LED or the tungsten lights at one point, and that was all being done with Notch. And the actual show itself was all run on standalone. A lot of people don't necessarily use that, but back in the day, it made a lot of sense at the time. And so we had a MIDI controller that controlled just some custom-built PCs. And then I would ask Matt every day questions about standalone, and he would say, "Why are you using standalone?" So, which led to a lot of that um, for most of the show. But the show is interesting. Notch was used in a way that actually the creative directors on the show really let us play with it a bit. And one of the initial gags of why this got into the show is we were playing with it, and we were actually filming the set and then doing effects on just a random IMAG shot. So you can see there's the lights on top, and there's just a static shot that's filming that, and then doing just this way over the top particle effect. It turned into a thing that was content for part of the show. So that's really why Notch got involved, was for something specific like that. And then it turned into Kanye loving Notch, by the way. So he posted this on Twitter. I don't know if you knew that. So he was really excited about it. And then once the show opened, it turned into more of IMAG effects on him during the show. But it was an interesting touch onto it because it is a show about lighting, but still adding some sort of IMAG effects into it was a cool thing. So there's a screenshot from Builder. So for me, the takeaway from this show, like I said, was using standalone at a very early time, and using Notch. It had only been public for a little bit, or available to the public after it had been rebranded as Notch. So this is right after the first LA training where a bunch of guys went out and kind of figured it out. And some things worked, some things didn't work, but it was a really interesting first foray into really big pop shows. I will say, as a disclaimer, I'm always giving my perspective from the US, which is different than the guys over here in the UK who've been using Notch a lot longer. And I think this is around the same time the Sigaros was going out, and U2 is happening on the same time. So different timelines, but everyone was learning kind of at the same time. And then here's one other clip of, again, using Notch sort of as content. So this awesome light rig that they had would do these crazy interstitial moments where it would light up, but on the screens we would do affected IMAG just shooting the set itself. It was also probably one of the more ridiculous shows I've ever seen in terms of the audience all being on the ground instead of having a stage. So, a little example of that. Cutting about 6 months ahead, this is with another company I was with at the time called Empirical Studio, which was myself and Ben Nicholson and some of the guys from Treatment here in the UK. And Brett Bolton was there, wherever he is, helping us out. We had a funny moment where we were going to do the Bruno Mars 24 Karat Magic tour. A couple years, I think it was 2017. And we had a conversation with Matt and Luke, and we were saying we're really interested in doing shows with Notch, just not as IMAG effects, but as full content. And we only had, it was very last minute because Bruno Mars doesn't really like content so much usually. He actually doesn't really think of it as part of his show, so it was kind of a last minute, we should have content for the show. So we had about 15 days, which is not enough. And I called Matt and Luke and said, hey, we're going to do the whole show in Notch. All of the content, all the IMAG, everything in 15 days. And are you sure? Can you not do that, please? Because it was really early on still. There's a lot of things that we're still working on. So it was definitely an adventure in, trial by fire. But I think we learned a lot from it, and a lot of good things came from it. So I have a little bit of some examples from it. So the stage design was just basically one big screen, and then there was a little riser that came up with some screens on it. And then this is kind of the front of house view showing Notch right next to the D3 programmer, and then some IMAG effects. But here's some samples of stuff we did for the show. So basic text effects, very simple shapes, but it was on that screen that would come out of the floor. So it was more about backlighting the band. So his whole vibe for that time, if you keep up with Bruno Mars, is very 90s-esque, right? So it was supposed to look like the Coming Attractions trailers from the mid-90s or something like that. So it was all very simple design, and there was also not a lot of time. But again, keyframing all of this ahead of time, this was actually rendered out and played back off of the D3 as a movie clip, not even in Notch. Again, another very, very simple look. It's almost embarrassingly simple, but it's exactly what he needed because there's a bunch of flames in front of this and IMAG and stuff like that. Again, very simple, primitive designs, but using cloners, and back in the day it was a shape 2D, which doesn't exist anymore. But doing simple things with Notch was able to get us to something pretty quickly. that, you know, we could have done this in After Effects as well, but it was, again, going through the motions of, okay, how do I keyframe this? How do I add a speed ramp for this and add sound modifiers for some things, but not for other things, kind of putting it through the paces that maybe you hadn't done before. So this is actually a Brett Bolton special, which is fantastic. This is an alternate version of that song that actually ended up getting cut. But this is really interesting for us. The stage had a bunch of these light panels that were built in, and so Brett made this design of this crazy modifier chain that could do all of these things. And it was a really high quality look in a pretty short amount of time. So this one is actually one of my favorite pieces of Notch content that's been done in a while because it doesn't look like Notch at all. This is, I think, a bunch of different 2D patterns and textures that were brought in, turned into sort of GIFs and like very, very simple loops. And then Brett also did this one, lots of simple compositing and looping and frame feedback to make it look like it's hand-drawn 15 frames, you know, animation, as opposed to something that's really intense in 3D and volumetric lighting and all that stuff like that. Like using Notch for something that you would normally do in a 2D software, I think is really interesting because we hadn't really seen a lot of that yet at the time. I think everything has been particles and all this other stuff. So a good example of something that is a little different. All right, cool. There were funny moments throughout this tour, like us trying to figure out splines into Notch. So we thought it would come into, and then that's what it looked like when it came into Notch. Not necessarily Notch's fault, but it was just, you know, those early days of no Facebook user group or anything like that, and you're just trying to figure it out. But we had a lot of fun trying to, you know, troubleshoot everything. Keyframing for the first time in Notch. If you want to vomit everywhere. Yeah. It was great, though, actually, to be honest. I mean, keyframes were deleting themselves and disappearing, but the way that curves work in Notch is really interesting, that we actually found there are some things that were quicker than what we would normally do in After Effects, but it was definitely a different approach, and everyone trying to figure it out on the fly with not much sleep, and lots and lots of node graphs that looked like that. And then the most memorable part of the tour, I think, for Brett or anyone else was there, was a lot of this. It was at a time where also we were trying to boot camp things, and there was all sorts of funny support issues with Razer at the time, with Wi-Fi cards going bad and stuff like that. But it was really fun to send one of these every 10 to 15 minutes to Matt and Luke and just be like, you know, it's Notch's fault, but not really. There's also a tornado while we were there, just to, like, you know, make it more fun. Okay, so that was Bruno Mars, and I just wanted to go back and show that a little bit because it was, you know, early on, like I said. I'm trying to think, I think this was the following summer, probably another 6 months. We'd used Notch in a bunch of other events. Other people had started to use it now in touring. I think there'd been 3 or 4 more trainings now, so we're probably at, you know, 200 users or something like that, a little bit further along. We got to a point where, you know, I was able to put it into more of the world of like the big pop shows that I normally do. So this is with Pink, and in 2017 she did a summer festival tour, and you know, Notch is still seeing a little bit of a risk, maybe, perhaps. So we were able to have it on a festival tour as opposed to a huge arena tour because it was less pressure, I guess. But this is the first time I and my team really put this into some sort of standardized workflow. In terms of, you know, Notch a lot of times has been seen as kind of science project-y, maybe, or it was in the time, like 2 guys sitting at a desk trying to figure it out, you know, just live, you know, networking in and figuring it on the fly. Whereas this one, we're going to operate the whole show from a lighting desk using Sock Puppet with D3 or Disguise, and it was going to be programmed by another person. In our workflow, I spoke about it earlier in another talk. In the US, there's a lot of times where content companies will make content, and then there's another company that's there to program, there's another company that does the servers, blah, blah, blah. So this is one of those things where we had made this stuff, we're going to hand it off to someone and work with them together to program it. So we had to be very organized with, you know, spreadsheets and really, really talk about what we're doing with every exposed parameter. Some example images from some of it. Also, things definitely got to another level when it turned into content in terms of complexity. Again, keyframing in Notch with another one of those crazy node graphs you saw, but something that had a little more depth to it. Another piece of content that had a decent amount of depth. Also, you know, this is after the comment node came out, which was great, so we could actually organize our work, which is a good thing. So this is an example of a clip. This was rendered out of Notch and played back in D3. It did not run in real time. There's, you know, I don't remember how many cloners there are, and volumetric lights and really nice shadows and stuff like that. So with like a 1080 at the time, I think it played back at 20 frames per second or something like that. But using it in a workflow where you can make traditional content, it was way better than waiting 2 hours for an Octane render or something like that to get those same amount of shadows. This is another look that was fairly simple. It's not so complex, but again, being able to get some volumetric lighting and lots of lighting passes and seeing it in real time and actually sitting with her and the artist and talking about how light should move, being able to move the camera, change the shape. It was kind of a different workflow than we've been able to do in the past with traditional content. Another song, sound modifiers and live input in to get the recording of the band and then rendering it out later, but things like the flashes are done with modifiers as opposed to keyframing everything. All right, I'm just going to skip on from this for time's sake. When we did the lighting desk control, both of those examples I just showed were actually pre-rendered content as opposed to ones that were controlled from the desk. But when we did do effects from the desk, like this frame feedback sort of stretchy, sort of look, we would expose, color of the clones, the distance between them, the speed that they would spread apart, stuff like that. It really was a really nice look into how you could get into a more traditional programming workflow where you only have a couple days to do this. So you can use the Grand MA2 effects engine to say, I want to hit this one cue, and the next time I want it to be 25% lower and 25% lower, and do a descending sine down or something like that. Something you can do in D3 if you want to program it, or in Notch, but doing it on the desk and saying apply to everything on the song, copy paste presets. It really, really led to a lot of efficiencies along the way. Excuse me. Talking about the rest of that show, this is a good case study because in our world, this is showing how Notch has become part of our life. There's traditional content on the show. She had these giant inflatable voodoo doll things, so we got a 3D scan of that and made content of them dancing like silly people and their heads exploding. So that was, traditional content, After Effects, Cinema 4D, normal things. This was another piece that we did a shoot with her, and it was a pretty advanced, like Houdini and Nuke workflow, which is more akin to what we would normally do in a show. But then you get into other songs like that I just showed you, the Just Like Fire with the Gears. That was a hybrid. So the end of the song featured, I'll probably still a bit. The end of the song featured a scene rendered from Octane. The beginning of it was done in Notch. So again, editing two pieces together like a traditional pipeline. Client doesn't even know that it's Notch. It's just something we're choosing to do. Same with Just Like a Pill, like I showed you. The other workflow that we do, and a lot of people doing these live shows, is content from Notch or content from traditional things like After Effects or whatever, then loaded into D3. So it's a bunch of these clips and loops and GIFs and stuff like that that we would give to the programmer, sit with them, and then make an entire song out of all these little loops. And then the other flavor that was now added for the show is with that effect I just showed you with the separating clones of them is all Notch, but it's programmed in D3. So there are a couple songs like that. Sorry, guys, I'm sick. The other thing to talk about is that after the Pink Show and since then, it's kind of become a standard thing that we just use in our ecosystem. We don't think about Notch as like, oh, we need to tell the client that it's Notch unless it's real time, or we don't really talk about it. We just talk about what's the right tool for the right job. So if it makes sense to do an After Effects or Cinema or whatever, or Notch, we just choose to do that. So on Justin Timberlake's Super Bowl last year, all the particles on, there was like the star scene during the Prince moment. Most people didn't even see that screen on the camera feed, but they just wanted particles on those screens down there and all the way in the ribbon banners up top to match the glow motion LEDs. We just do that in Notch very, very quickly. We're able to just like, oh yeah, as an afterthought, provide that. Other shows recently is Katy Perry. She just needed one sparkly star, IMAG effect. We were able to do that. And then most recently on Ozzy Osbourne's tour, there's a ton of IMAG effects for that. So it's just something that's just part of the natural world. I know that this is being recorded, and that's all good, but if you don't mind for the next little bit, if you don't take any pictures, that'd be appreciated. Some of the people I work with don't like pictures of their stuff out in the world. Yeah, thank you. Really, really big on Twitter, please. I mean, you can, I can't stop you, but it would be preferred. So another artist we worked with recently, or a couple artists we worked with recently are featured in this little sample of other Notch stuff that we've done. Lessons learned about Notch in general in a pop world. We talked about this a little bit earlier in another meeting, but for me, it's been a little bit of a constant battle of people calling Notch all of these things or asking for Notch because it's cheaper, quicker, or that it's just an effects box that you show up on site and push a button and then it just makes things happen, that it's instant content, or generative design with a one-man band. The word generative design is really interesting to me because generative effects are really cool and I really enjoy them, and I think we all try to use them in our stuff, but there's a really interesting point to talk to people that you can generate a lot of things, but designing as a thing is something that isn't necessarily usually generated. So yes, you can have an effect that you make, but you have to talk about what that effect is going to look like ahead of time as opposed to just showing up. For me, and a big thing that we've really learned is that I think Notch is most effective, and live effects in general are most effective when they follow a traditional workflow, just like normal content. So for us, this is kind of part of the process. It's not everything, but it starts with a client, whether it is a pop star or their creative director or whoever it is, coming to us saying, I want to do a song about dogs, whatever. They come to us with a creative brief saying, here's a bunch of pictures of dogs I kind of like, and here's the rough idea of what I want to do. We'll always go and internalize that and give them another document back that says, this is how we interpret your want about dogs, and we think it should be about these 3 dogs specifically, and this is, whatever. Like being really, really, specific with it so that it's clean and clear. That then goes to design frames of us, mocking it up in Photoshop or After Effects or Notch nowadays a lot of times of what we think it's going to look like what the final product is. So that, this is what you want, are you sure? And then move on from there. This follows along with animatics and storyboards. We don't always storyboard everything. It's a little bit, intense to have to do that. But with Notch, we still try to do animatics. So let's say we're doing live effects for that pink example I showed you. We're going to have her spread apart. We're going to say, okay, cool, on the verse, it's going to do this. And on the chorus, it's going to change to this color. And then it's going to do these other things. Of course, it's live music and live shows, so it's going to change. You're going to get on site and you're going to want to tweak it. But at least you have some consideration about what the scope is going to be. And then all the way through into the first version. Version 1s are really hard in Notch, we've all been finding. Someone else asked a question earlier about like how do you show someone something before it exists? And in Notch, that's just increasingly difficult. Like we want to do this cool AR gag with the artist and all these other things. And a lot of times it's based off of a specific camera shot. But if you're not in rehearsals with that artist, with the right lighting and all those things, that IMAG effect might not work at all. So a lot of times you have to mock it up with stock footage or pre-shoots, all these other things, and sometimes you have to just do the job of selling to your client what you're going to be able to achieve. But it's not easy. So that's something we've been trying to figure out, and I'm curious to talk to other people about that as well, is, how do you, especially with IMAG effects, like show people what it's going to be like or propose what it's going to be like? It can be pretty difficult. A lesson learned on this, and there's different debates on all this, and I talked about it earlier. It does come a little bit into the financial aspect of things when it comes into these big, large shows. There's larger budgets than your average show, but even on the smaller ones too, the question as a content designer and creator, are you providing a service to someone with your time, or are you providing deliverables? And of course, the answer for a lot of us is that it's both. You are creating a product at the end of the day, you hand them a hard drive and here you go, but you're also spending your time there and providing a service. But I think it's very important, especially in the touring world, that you try to talk with someone about what those deliverables are and what you're going to give them for that price. And that's why there's a budget for it, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to provide my service and show up, and then whatever we get, which, sometimes has to be, I understand that it's an option or it needs to be the case, but I think it's an interesting thing to talk about with these, especially large scale shows. If I did Taylor Swift or whatever artist and showed up and said, I'm going to be there for 10 days and it's X amount of money, that dollar figure would be very, very different than what it actually costs to make that show. And the amount of people and time and stuff like that. So it brings up an interesting conversation when it comes into Notch and real-time content, is that yes, we can make these choices in real time, but those decisions on site are based off of a month and a half of research and design and preparation. Again, design is a big part of Notch that I think is really worth focusing in on. We've seen a lot of talks and people who were on stage earlier were showing, really, really high quality renders that is based off of design and preparation. But there's other aspects of design that are now coming up with Notch, which is system design, of course. How is this media service system going to work that's playing back this content or this real-time effects? Are there black tracks cameras? Is there Connect? All these other things. And then there's integration of all those things and programming and actually, hitting play. Playback, I guess, isn't on here, or operation. But there's all these different steps. And I just think it's interesting to bring up that as a content company, I'm only involved in the first step of this, but all of a sudden I'm involved in every conversation along the whole way. Whereas back in the day for pre-rendered stuff, I just, give you a file and you hit play and then we're all happy. So it's an interesting change in my life with how we all work together. And I think it's interesting for everyone to talk about those things. I think it's also really interesting to go back to the business aspect of it, to be really clear with everyone, especially if you're in the US, about where your boundaries and where your lines and responsibilities go. There's a lot of interesting moments with Notch where if you're doing a real-time effect where, as a content designer, I could give, World Stage, for example, or VER, or whoever is doing it, as a vendor, a block that I forgot a keyframe on the very, very end of my track that turns 10 million particles on and the whole system goes down. That's all of a sudden in my world. Before, when I was doing content, I could never take down a system, unless it was a corrupt frame or something. So all of a sudden, there's like these different zones of responsibility. And so it's interesting on the system design side and the integration side to also check to make sure that the content team knows what they're doing. And, it's just new conversations about things that we've never had to talk about before. So I think it's interesting. Again, I guess I'm going to kind of wrap up a little bit so we can get on to drinks. But I just think the cool thing about Notch in my world and like live touring and concerts as well as other events is that it's just about using the right tool for the job. It's a choice to use it when we want to use it as opposed to, using it just for the sake of it. I think it is becoming more and more the right tool for a lot of different jobs, which is really interesting. And if you saw those, the keyframe graphs earlier, you can do it, in the same way that you do normal content. So I think it's really growing to a new place. Happy notching. I will also say from my world, it's really important to me and everyone here that we continue to use notch puns as much as possible. It really is a really good pastime. I think Armin's the expert at it, but make sure you do that. But thank you. I'll do questions, I think. Can I do questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, if there's any. Drinks, yeah. Hey.
You thought the Omega effects outweigh content from Notch?
They outweigh it in terms of like their use or the requests? Yeah, so in my world, in rock and roll and pop shows, definitely we get asked more for IMAG effects, and then you choose to use Notch for it rather than some artist saying, I would like you to render this piece of content in Notch, It's actually been a big conversation that a lot of us have had earlier, is that's actually one of the reasons why Notch became so popular over the last 2 years was tours like Ed Sheeran and I don't know, Beyonce using it, other people like that. Then it's a way for pop stars to show their pretty face on screen still and have it be content as opposed to not. Because let's be honest, people are paying a lot of money to go to these big shows to see those pop stars as opposed to seeing this really nice thing that we've done. So yeah, I would say that IMAG has been a huge part of it. Yeah.
You don't want to answer something, but two-part question. One is you guys were talking about before in terms of pricing and how you approach it, in terms of how the workflow is different now as you have all the research and development, and then the actual show is a little bit more straightforward. Has it been a challenge for you to quote-unquote sell this to the client in terms of if it's more expensive, how to justify it?
So the question is, have I been able to justify if it's been more expensive for Notch, or rather, has it been more expensive for Notch with billing and stuff like that? And it just depends on everything. Again, I think Nick mentioned it really well in the earlier talk about he makes his pricing and budgets based off of what the ask or what the end goal is and what are the steps needed to take that. So if I'm doing a special IMAG effect for a pop star that requires black tracks and all these other cameras and all these other things, there's going to be all these other stuff involved that now costs more money, but it's because they want to achieve that effect as opposed to, hey, let's just toss this in and just make it work. So it hasn't really affected so much. It's affected it sometimes that people have approached me with lower budgets because they think that Notch is free or cheap, and then we've had to make it work.
I don't know how you guys do content, but let's say you're building a system for somebody, for an artist, or like if you're making content for somebody, sometimes you want the content, sometimes the artist wants the content. How do you approach this when you're making a system? Like building a machine in Notch, do you offer to give it to them, or is it something you own?
You're talking about like ownership after the show is done, basically? Yeah.
And if it's just a video, like use
Yeah.
forever, but if it's a system that you built for them to use
Yeah.
forever, how do you?
This is a huge thing that comes up a lot of times, actually, and that's something that usually isn't realized until like the last day of the show or rehearsals. A lot of pop stars go like, or production managers would be like, wait a second, if this was content, I could just go to another one-off and just take all these files and hit play on them. But now to do this notch stuff again, they have to bring this whole system there. And there's a little bit of this like moment for a lot of people, but contracts are a whole thing to talk about, and maybe another 6-hour session. But like it definitely is important. You know, if you're doing stuff with clients, I would be really clear with them about what, again, your deliverables are and what you own, what they own. I mean, I don't want to talk too much about what our specific contracts are like, but yeah, it's something that comes up a lot, is that this effect, actually this came up a ton with Matt in the very beginning on a lot of these shows. He added the creator tag in Notch, so you can see in the root node, you know, who worked it last, because in the early days, there was a lot of like someone grabbing a Notch block from this show and putting it onto this show and then charging money for it and all sorts of stuff like that, like Wild West a little bit. So it is important, you know, and especially if you do an effect for someone. And say you do an effect for Bono and U2, that's a sparkly star thing, and he's like, this is my effect, it's great. And you go to another show and he sees Taylor Swift with the sparkly star thing. Well, it's like, you know, it's just using 2 plugins and you turn them on and that's it, you know? So it's very hard to defend intellectual property on this sort of stuff. But yeah, it's a big conversation for sure. I don't know if there's any other questions.
Which tour was the heaviest, talking about loads of notch used on the tour?
I think probably Taylor Swift was the largest one most recently, because every single song had to use Notch in it.
And have you still been using like external machine to run Notch, or everything was exposed to media server control via sock puppets? Or
Yeah, for us it's been, for us it's pretty much been run on Disguise with a stock puppet control. The only time I've ever done standalone was on Kanye, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But yeah, we normally work, like I was talking about, we work with usually other programming companies that will be programming it, so we normally deliver files and program with someone. But yeah, it's normally run in Disguise.
That's going to be the last question.
Okay.
How is your workflow in the desk? So you build the scene in Notch, and then you expose the parameters to Artnet, and Artnet is then altering the scene, or are you basically like making moving paths for objects that come into my time code?
Yeah. So the question is, what is the workflow for using Notch in with Lighting Desk integration? And it's a kind of a big conversation, but the way we do it primarily for iMag effects is we have a standard set with this big template that's caused a lot of woe. But we have standard effects that we use so that when you jump from scene to scene, there's always color correction, blur, stuff like that available. And we have 8 custom parameters for each song. So let's say that one song with the separation of cloners, there's, you know, we're probably using 4 of those effects that change the different widths. And so we make sure we set it to all be normalized for Lighting Desk. So it starts at 127 or whatever. But yeah, I could talk to you more about it later. But yeah, it's basically just trying to create a very standardized workflow for large shows. So all the way, just do it. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
JT.